Hello, everybody. Like Jane Lucas said, I regret that I'm the one speaking to you today. So our first author, Samina from Delphi University of Technology, she put a lot into this paper, and I wish she could be the one speaking to you today, but she's Iranian, and given the current political climate, that proved to be problematic. But I'll do my best to convey what we learned in this paper. So, in general, what we're interested in is seeing what effect security controls and investments and defensive measures have on outcomes. And for the purpose of this paper, we're studying the prevalence of web compromise as the outcome of interest, and we're seeing to what extent investments in security defenses by the webmaster and by the hosting provider, to what extent those influence the prevalence of abuse. So, to motivate, here is a high-level architecture of web-based attacks. We have our hacker, who's a fish in a hat. I guess it is Halloween after all. And he compromises a lot of websites like fluffybunnies.org, limecats.it, cutedogs.com. These are all legitimate websites. Perhaps they've been shadowed, and they're compromised for other purposes that criminals set forward. Things like hosting phishing pages, launching malware, and so forth. And so the question that we're interested in is, to what extent are the practices of the webmasters and the people in control of the websites like fluffybunnies.org, to what extent can they actually invest in security measures that will make it less likely that they're compromised? And is it just their responsibility, or does it fall to other actors further up the stack? So we have lots of intermediaries on the web, and in this case we're going to be looking at web hosting companies who are often in a good position to try to take steps to improve the security of these websites. So the other motivation for this is that when we start to look at things like hosting providers, we can see that there are many attempts to sort of talk about the prevalence of abuse at different providers. And so this is a screenshot from Google's Safe Browsing Transparency Report, which shows, as of yesterday, the top 10 hosting providers who have the highest fractional incidence of malware and phishing on their website. And so this sort of implicit in efforts like this is a suggestion that providers who have higher rates of abuse are likely at fault, and there needs to be steps taken to encourage them to improve the security for their customers. And so what we're taking a step back is saying, okay, is that really the case? And to what extent is the responsibility on webmasters, and to what extent is the responsibility on the hosting companies to try to prevent the occurrence of abuse in the first place? So this leads to the question, which is, how much abuse can providers realistically prevent? Because the compromise rates are at least partially driven by the factors that they cannot control, whether or not their webmasters choose poor passwords, whether their security practices and hygiene are effective. There's also just attacker effects. So attackers may prefer to target certain providers, and then you see concentration nationally rising that way. And it really just remains unclear how much the efforts to secure these websites at hosting providers actually influences the prevalence of abuse. And that's the question we hope to answer. And here is our conceptual causal model that we're working with. And so in white here we see sort of different effects. So we have in this blue box, we have different security efforts like investments into security controls, firewall configurations, IDS, this kind of thing. These influence, you would hope, your security level of an organization. And then this sort of eventually relates to the actual incident of abuse. But in this paper, we're going to focus largely on constructing features like these blue circles here, which are things that we can measure, which go into the security efforts that an organization and webmasters take. We're also going to have to consider that there are different factors that affect the exposure of a website or a hosting company to abuse. Things like the popularity of the websites, the popularity of the provider itself, the pricing plan, the level of service that they provide. Okay, so overall our objective is to disentangle the joint responsibility that exists for security between the hosting companies and webmasters themselves. And so how we're going to do this is by indirectly measuring the security efforts by collecting the whole large pile of features that we can directly observe, and then tease out the underlying effects. So the contributions are, first, we provide, we think is the first comprehensive measurement study of shared web hosting providers. And I'll talk about what those are in a second, where we sampled around 500,000 domains across 1,300 shared hosting providers, which we think is actually approaching the entire population of shared web hosting companies. To do this, we demonstrate a new statistical approach that's going to distinguish the joint contribution of web hosting providers and webmasters to security. And what do we find? Well, among other things, we find that both the efforts of the webmaster and the provider significantly can reduce phishing, malware, and abuse. So where's the data and how do we collect it? So again, our focus is on what are called shared hosting providers. So what is a shared web hosting company? Well, they'll have physical servers and server resources that are shared among multiple customers. So you'll have a single box that will be hosting the websites of many different distinct domain names. And then because of this environment, where you don't want to have the practices of one customer affecting the others, you have the customers themselves operating under restricted privileges, which give hosting providers administrative privileges and much greater control over the configurations of the websites themselves, including things like which software should be installed and whether or not it's updated. And so this, for us, is a nice test case as to whether or not hosting companies can be expected to influence the prevalence of web compromise. Because if web hosting companies can't actually influence the prevalence of abuse and shared hosting, then they don't have any hope of doing it for hosting writ large. So how do we identify shared hosting companies? Well, we started with data from passive DNS. So basically, we took all of the domains that were observed on passive DNS from Farsight, and then we got their corresponding IPs, and then looked up the whois IP information to identify the organizations that were responsible for the IPs that were observed. We did some clustering to try to group similar sounding names of organizations together, and then we took a step where we had to exclude things like Cloudflare and other anti-DDoS providers, domain parkers, and so forth, because our ultimate goal is to get to a list of shared hosting companies. And then what we did is we identified a set of what we think were web hosting companies, both shared and not shared. And then we moved to define shared hosting companies as organizations that had IP addresses under their control that had at least 10 domains that we observed that per IP. And so why do we use 10? Well, there's a graph I could show you that basically this seems to indicate at this threshold that we had a high confidence that these were in fact shared hosting companies. So from this we ended up with what we thought were a large number of shared hosting companies, and for each one of them we took a random sample of up to 500 domains that were hosted on that company. We ended up with around 500,000 domains spanning almost 1,300 shared hosting providers. Again, we think this, based on our methodology, is actually a comprehensive listing of nearly every shared hosting company of significant size in the world. And then from that, we were able to measure certain features of the websites themselves. And to do that, we used the distributed crawling infrastructure with a headless browser that would visit up to 20 pages per website. And then would identify things like the server software that was running and the version information. And then we use off-the-shelf tools to identify security characteristics as well. In the end, we visited just about 7.5 million web pages over the course of a week to construct our features. And what were our features? They essentially boiled down to two types. We had security features, things that we could observe, like the presence of HTTP-only cookies, configurations. Did they turn on DNSSEC? All sorts of various things that we could directly observe. You see the pluses and minuses. The pluses mean that the presence of this feature indicates a good thing for security, whereas a minus means it's not. So if we could detect that it allowed for mixed content inclusions, that was a bad thing, whereas supporting HTTP-only cookie is a good thing. And then, so we had this bucket of security features, and then separately we had software features. So we looked at the type of server software that was running and its version, SSL, its version, and then we looked further up the stack to things like the admin panel, so like things like cPanel and different leading providers, and we looked at PHP, presence and version information, and for leading content management systems, whether they were present and their version. So those are our features. The last data for us is phishing data. So here we have two forms of abuse data. We have phishing data and drive-by download malware. The phishing data came from the APWG. Drive-by download malware came from Google Safe Browsing's malware list. We collected data for about 6 months and got several 100,000 domains that experienced abuse. One of the things that's noteworthy here is, we found that of all of these two data sources of abuse, between around 35% of the domains that we observed were hosted on one of these shared hosting platforms. So this gives you an idea that the shared hosting infrastructure is a significant fraction of the overall web hosting infrastructure. Okay, so that's the data. So what did we find? So there's two things I want to talk to you about today. One is sort of our descriptive findings about the landscape, because we now have this fairly comprehensive sampling of what's going on at shared hosting companies. And then we'll talk about our statistical models to actually relate security investment to outcomes. So the security features I just showed you, how often do we find them? This table the results are actually somewhat depressing in that the security features that we searched for were very only sparsely identified. Okay, so the most common security feature we could find was the HTTP only cookie, and that was only in 13% of all of the domains we inspected, and then it just goes down from there. So we've heard that content security policy, it's a great defense against cross-site scripting, and yet we only found it in 0.2% of the shared domains in our sample. So we have all these great technologies and configurations that are used to defend against attacks. And when we find it in practice, these things are not used very much at all. The only silver lining here, I would say, is that certain negative activities were also not observed very frequently. So we saw only very few cases where mixed content inclusions were supported. So various vulnerabilities were also uncommon, so that's good. Now, along the bottom here is the first of several histograms I'm going to show you, where what it shows you is sort of a count of our hosting providers that fall into different percentiles, from the 10th percentile up to the 100th percentile. And so this bottom left one shows for content security policy, we see that nearly all of the providers, well over 90%, of all of the domains that they were responsible for, between 0 and 10% of them actually had content security policy enabled. And in fact, overall the answer was primarily 0. So this is not hardly used at all. It's really hard to see here, but there's one little point down here around the 90th percentile where there were a handful of providers who actually did implement a content security policy, and they implemented it broadly across all of their customer base. And for that one data point, we did actually see a lower incidence of abuse. You look at the HTTP only cookie, the distribution's a little bit better, but we have a significant fraction with very low amounts, and then some a bit higher, and then the tail falls off quickly. Onto the patching practices. So we identified different server software that was running on these shared hosts, and one of the things we wanted to check out was, were they actually running the most recent version of the software at the time of our scanning? And so what we found here is, so the darkest blue here is what is the fraction that was patched. The lighter blue was unpatched, and then the white and gray are either we didn't discover the software or we couldn't identify the version information. So if you just sort of compare the two blue shades, what we see is that the majority of the SSL software installations we could find were up to date, but it was much lower for SSH, low again for PHP. We look at the panel. The panel software. Unfortunately, the majority of the panels where we could identify version information, it was out of date. So quite broadly across the shared hosting platform are these admin panels not up to date. And contrast that with CMSs, where we actually found that although a substantial fraction of CMSs where we could identify the version was out of date, the majority were up to date. Moving on here, if instead of looking at the individual domains space and aggregating across all the domains, if we look a bucket by provider, we can see that this is what the distribution looks like. We find that overall, the most common occurrence here is somewhere between 20 and 30% of a provider's customers are running outdated content management system software. Whereas outdated HTTP server is almost uniformly distributed. We hypothesize that this uniform distribution is a result of companies rolling in new machines into their infrastructure, and when they put the new machines in, it's up to date, but the older servers continue to run the outdated software. So you update by buying new hardware. And then this last one here is for admin panel. What we see is that, fortunately, the single most common case was that the largest number of providers had very few outdated admin panels, but there is quite a long tail where even some providers, between 90 and 100% were outdated. Okay, so what have we done? I've told you about the data. I've told you about some of our descriptive findings about what we see in terms of secure and software configurations at shared hosting providers. Now we're going to talk a bit about the actual statistical model. And to do this, we have to model security as a latent factor. So what do I mean by this? Well, this is our causal model here. And I'm going to zoom into the top part here, where we just look at how all these different features that we collect information on provide input to this measurement of what the effort towards security webmasters and providers take. And we're going to estimate this as a latent variable. What that means is that rather than directly regressing on the observance of these different features on the prevalence of abuse, we're going to see if we can identify some underlying hidden variables. And so how do we do this? We use something called factor analysis, where we take all of our features here, and we identify and group features together if the features correlate with each other and have low correlation with all of the other variables. And when we do that, we end up with these four groupings that of variables that group together. And luckily for us, if you read those carefully, you'll find that they all fit to different categories that are consistent. So the first grouping corresponds to the content security practices of a website. The second has to do with the specific practices of a webmaster. And then the third and fourth have to do with infrastructure sites, infrastructure security, and then web app security practices. So the last grouping is things like CMS and admin panel patching. So we've got these four different categories, and looking at them, we think that these bottom two are ones that are going to be more likely for that the hosting provider would have control over. And so to test and see if that was actually the case, we did something where we actually just looked at the hosting provider fixed effects. And what that means is that we're not considering abuse data at all at this point. What we're doing is we're looking at our different response variables and seeing to what extent they compared to just the fixed effects for hosting providers. So how much variation among different providers can be explained by the presence of these different security variables here. And what we find is, and the only line you really need to pay attention to is this R squared, because what we find is that MR1 and MR2, the ones which I would say providers have less control over, you have a lower R squared, which means that there's less correlation to the providers themselves, whereas you have higher R squared for MR3 and MR4, which indicates that the providers do likely exert more control over the configurations. So that's interesting. So we think we have this model where there are certain factors that the providers control, and now we want to see if the values for these latent variables actually influence abuse rates in the form of phishing and malware counts. So that's where we'll go next. And so back to our model here, we're basically we're going to start by, again, taking the security effort modeled by these 4 latent variables, and then we're going to relate that to actual abuse events, and another giant table that you don't need to read. But what this is showing is the results from our regression, each column represents a different regression, and the thing I'll point you out to first is the column number 2 here, which is our baseline regression model, where we don't consider any of the security variables 1 through 4. All we regress on are 2 sizing variables: the number of domains that are on shared hosting and the number of IPs that are on shared hosting. What we find is that, as expected from prior work, 71% of the variance between the occurrence of abuse at a provider can be explained by the size of that provider. And this is intuitive. But what this tells you is that large providers are going to see more abuse. There's nothing you can do about that. But what that also tells us is that once we add in our security factors, we can sort of see that the additional variation can be explained by these security variables. And overall, this rightmost column here shows the regression where we include all 4 of the security variables, and we can see that content security and webmaster security and web application security are all statistically significant, and collectively they explain an additional 22% variant of the variance beyond just the size variables that we've seen before. So there's still a lot of unexplained variance that's out there. I mean, after all, we just had these 15 factors that we could measure, but we can see that there actually is this effect, and it's consistent, and it's observable. This is for the phishing data. The malware data tells a consistent, although weaker story, and effectively what we find is that when you throw all 4 of the variables in to this regression, the only one that remains significant is webmaster security, which is tied to largely driven by the presence of the HTTP cookie. HTTP only cookie, and there we see an additional 9% variance over and above size explained. So, to wrap up, what have we done here? We have undertaken an extensive study of web security efforts that helped us study the landscape of security hygiene among webmasters and shared hosting companies. And we've come up with this approach that separates out the provider's efforts and the customer efforts, and we've been able to see whether or not those defensive efforts impact web compromise. Overall, from the security landscape, what do we see? Well, it's again this sad story that most security features are sparsely implemented by webmasters or the companies, but higher levels of the web stack, like CMS and admin panel, tend to be more up to date than infrastructure software. What have we done? We've done this indirect measurement of security effort, where unlike prior work, we're not modeling security features and software configurations directly causing compromise. Instead, we've constructed these latent factors which drive that. We showed that there actually is an effect, but that comes from both webmasters and providers that inhibits malware and phishing abuse. So looking to the future, in my -1 minute, I would say that we want to collect additional discriminating features to explain more variance, right? So we got 10 to 22% additional variance, so that's good, but we could do better, I think, if we collected more features. We'd like to maybe model effects at the individual level rather than at the aggregating counts by the provider level. And then I think most promisingly, for those of you in the room here, I think that we have this problem of joint responsibility everywhere in security. It's never anyone's fault that something gets hacked. It can be caused by the provider, it can be caused by the webmaster, it can be caused by the domain name registrar if they get hacked and passwords are leaked. There's a whole lot of responsibility to go around, and we need to actually account for that in our statistical models. Thank you for your attention.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for Thank you for your great work. So intuitively, I would expect that most of these compromises in shared hosting is because of some out-of-date CMS or a plugin or extension for such a CMS, right? So, how do you am I wrong based on your findings, or is it like that someone is abusing, the wrong PHP version that shared hosting provider so and so has and that's how the break-ins occur.
Well, you're not wrong, but you may not be right either. We actually don't know from this because and this gets to the second point of future work. We were collecting data aggregated by hosting provider, and rather than at the individual website level. And I think to actually get at whether or not it's a particular, whether or not it's the CMS being outdated versus something else would require us to do all the analysis at the individual level, which is quite difficult to do because would have to collect all of that data at the time of compromise. But it's something that we'd like to work to in the future.
Can I ask one more question? So, so again, based on your data and your understanding, right? So is it that it's the same vulnerable software that's installed into different shared hosting providers, and that the same sort of, let's say, bot-related hacks occur, but one of them has a more difficult to exploit underlying environment and the other one hasn't, and that's why the exploitation works on one and not the other? Because again, it would be up to the user of a shared hosting provider to install the wrong software or use bad credentials, right? So is it that the underlying environment makes it hard?
Well, I mean, I think it's possible, and I think it really depends on the compromises, right? So, some compromises, some attackers work in different ways, right? And so, in some cases, it may be entirely just stolen passwords. In other cases, they're exploiting a known outdated vulnerability in the CMS. And so, but the problem is that there's all these possibilities, and we don't get to see which one the attacker is using. We just get to see it all jumbled together. And so I think it can be all of those things. But what we're doing in this work here is to try to say something about this all in the aggregate, which I think is maybe accurate, but is somewhat lacking in explanatory power of this is what caused that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Francisco. Thanks for the great talk. I also have two questions. One is quick. Just for the outdated versions, how do you determine that something is outdated? So, for example, WordPress, they have security fixes even for older versions.
Yeah.
So did you say, okay, if it's not built with whatever the current version is, it's outdated, or within the branch?
So it depends. So there's this table in the appendix that shows all the particular version ranges that we consider to be up to date at that time, and it depends on the type of software whether we could say. Yeah.
Basically, you're looking at security issues and whether these have been addressed, I guess.
Okay.
So not functionality updates, like the main.
Not functionality updates. No.
And the other question is more going to the future. So trying to notify people about vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that your work can be used to, depending on the type of vulnerability that you want to kind of inform people about, you should use different strategies of maybe talking to the hosting provider to try to find a webmaster and so on?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating question. I'm together actually with this team in Delft. We have a whole research project that's about studying notification, right? And what's been kind of interesting and kind of frustrating about that is that we come up with these experiments where we send out notifications, sometimes to the hosting provider, sometimes to the webmaster. We vary who sends the email. We vary all these things, and what we find is that all these variations that we can introduce don't seem to make much of a difference in the main. It's like some fraction of the providers are gonna respond to your notification and others are not. That's where we are right now. I would love to get to a point to where we actually can identify better ways to improve response to notification, but we're not there yet. I think part of the reason why is that the underlying incentives explain things, right? So does the provider actually have an incentive to listen to your notification or not? More than anything, that is going to be what drives the response rate, and unfortunately, that's not something we can solve technically.
I'm from University of California, Riverside, and thank you for your talk. So my question is, you give a list of security features that you consider, and my question is, why these security features? Is it because you can capture them remotely, or can you give us an intuition that they are really influential in the final security?
Right. So yeah, why do we choose these? Because largely it's because these are the ones that we could publicly and passively observe. And I realize that there are limitations to that, but part of the way that we mitigate that limitation, that we're only getting the things that we can easily measure, is that we do this latent factor analysis to see that if there are certain things that we can measure, we actually try to group them together to hopefully something that's a stronger overall effect. But yeah, it's public passive measurement.
Have you considered other models such as graphical models or Bayesian nets or causal nets?
So what was the first one?
Graphical models, which is actually a superset on top of Bayesian nets.
Yeah.
It's a way of getting at latent
Not for this study yet, but we could consider investigating that. I mean, one thing I'll just say is, we're not doing machine learning here, right? So we are specific.
But those are different ways of getting at the underlying causal structure and latent variables. But
Yeah. We can let's talk more about it later. All right. Thank you very much.